Welcome to Leaders Lift, episode 36 for Wednesday, November 8th. I'm your host, Greg Cunningham. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. This week, in a follow-up to last week's episode, I want to talk about something that can happen not only when we rush, that was last week's episode, when we rush something or rush into something when we probably should not, but this is something that can happen definitely when we rush, but also at just about any time. So let me ask you this. Have you ever looked back at the last few hours or even a day or so and realized that you went down a path you hadn't anticipated? Compare this to the proverbial rabbit hole. Remember Alice trying to chase the white rabbit and ending up in Wonderland? Well, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. We take a path and it leads us somewhere that we didn't expect. Now, except for me, I'm not really talking about escaping to some magical world. Maybe some of you do, but I definitely don't. But I'm talking about getting pulled into an assignment, task, or even a train of thought, maybe a daydream or even something else that ends up consuming us mentally or physically. It takes our mental or physical energies, takes our time. And for me, generally, it's not something that is necessary and it usually doesn't turn out well. So let's dive in. Now, just a quick note, don't forget to subscribe, follow, like, share the podcast. Get the word out to those that haven't heard the podcast yet that could benefit from this, either from a leadership development perspective or from a personal development perspective. And check out the YouTube channel. You can search for Leaders Lift or LDRS LFT on YouTube. I've also got links to the channel in the show notes. So check out all of those things. And don't forget that the feedback form and a few other great resources are in the show notes and on my website at mountaineboconsulting.com. Okay, let's dive in. So what am I talking about? Maybe a little more in depth here. Maybe the best way I can describe what chasing a rabbit hole or falling down a rabbit hole is with an example. From an assignment or task standpoint, think about you starting to build a simple spreadsheet. And several hours later, you realize that you have connected multiple sheets, invented new formulas, and have something that you could never explain to anyone. Think way overcomplicated. And that it's actually not any better than what you might have had 30 minutes after you had started if you had stayed focused and on task. Or think about the last time that you started thinking about a situation and planning on what to do, and a few hours later you're ready to go back to bed or at least hide under the covers because you've identified every potential negative scenario and have no idea how to solve for them. Now, these might seem like extreme scenarios, especially the last one, but I hope you can see how these types of rabbit holes may come into your life or what you might have in your life that would be considered a rabbit hole. So how do we fall down the rabbit hole? Now, we don't see some imaginary character that looks completely out of place and we end up chasing it and we're so curious that we crawl into this dark, dirty, spider-filled, in my opinion, hole and fall into another world. But it is unique how this happens to each of us. For me, it happens most often when either things don't go well or they're not going well, I'm struggling with something. It also happens when I look too far into the future or when I'm unsure about something or I'm trying to figure something out for the first time. Or the other big scenario, and I've talked about this in the past, is when I'm trying to plan for or mitigate every possibility. That's that emergency preparedness side of my brain that I have. Those are the times that I end up headed down rabbit holes more often than anything else. The other thing is sometimes I also find my mind really wandering while I'm out on a walk or a bike ride, and maybe I've got music going in the background that I've heard a million times, but I end up coming up with realistic scenarios, but things that will never really happen. That might be me thinking about, oh, I hope I can get this promotion, or I hope I can get this project done this way, and it might lead to this and this and this and this and this. So some of these rabbit holes that I don't go down are wishful thinking, and some are me going down much more difficult and unnecessary paths. I don't know if that's how it happens to you, but that's some examples of how it happens to me. Hopefully, you can figure out how that applies in your life. Now, what does this do? The first thing that it does is it actually distracts us from what matters most. We're going to get off of whether we start down that spreadsheet that we could have done in 30 minutes and we're doing it for hours. Think of all the other things that you could have got done that are more important than trying to do that spreadsheet. when it didn't end up any better than it would in the first place. It can also cause stress that we absolutely do not need. The world has enough stress, right? We can't avoid a lot of the stress that comes from just being in this world. We really don't need to go in and create more for ourselves that's completely unnecessary. And then it also can cause additional problems, right? I mean, if I go down this rabbit hole, not just not getting other things done that are super important, but I may end up doing things I didn't even need to do, or it just ends up consuming us. And then finally, these rabbit holes can dramatically shift our mental state, right? We could be in a super, super good mood and we head down one of these rabbit holes and it gets more and more complicated and complex and dark and all of those kinds of things. And eventually, all of that happiness and excitement and stuff is just gone and we're just tired or worn out or whatever the case may be. So, these rabbit holes can have a significant impact on our realities, right? How we perceive the world around us and the mental state that we end up in. So, those are some of the impacts of these rabbit holes. You probably have some of your own. One of the things I'm going to talk about is how do we recognize when we're in a rabbit hole? I mean, besides it's dark and dirty and spiders are crawling all over you. Ugh, I don't do spiders. 2 years in Brazil, I don't do spiders. Bugs are just not a good thing after you've lived that close to the equator. Total sidebar. So, recognizing when we're headed down a rabbit hole, sometimes we actually don't recognize it until afterwards. But any effort we can put into recognizing it sooner while we're actually in the rabbit hole and doing something deliberate about it will be beneficial to us. Let me give you one example. As I was preparing this, so last week from when this show drops, I recognized that I was headed down one of these rabbit holes with some planning I was trying to do. I was trying to look into the future with the business and the podcasts and all of that kind of stuff. I recognized that I was headed down a rabbit hole because it seemed like I had this weight that just settled on my shoulders. And I couldn't really identify something real that caused it, right? It wasn't like I had just lost all my clients or that my computer blew up. I am getting a new computer. Tune into Gadgets for Family on that one, but it's doing fine right now. So there were none of these real things that could have caused so much stress and anxiety about the future. But it's just like this big weight settled in. And honestly, running a small business, that happens quite a bit. Now, the day really hadn't gone perfectly, but when do they ever? And the things that went wrong really shouldn't have caused that much weight to settle. What happened though was there was a chain reaction. I started thinking about this planning stuff and I saw one possible negative thing and then I picked up another and picked up another. And before you know it, again, I'm back in emergency preparedness mode. Combined with, I started to way overcomplicate the situation and started to think about and act on things that weren't really going on and that probably weren't going to happen in the future. And building this action plan and trying to figure out how I was going to mitigate this and that and blah, 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 blah. It's funny that I could actually see this as it was happening, not immediately, but a little while in. I could see what was going on. I recognized that I was going down this rabbit hole, but I struggled to get myself back onto more normal ground. And I'll talk about what I had to do here in just a minute. So that weight that I felt yesterday settle on me. That's one way that I recognize when I'm going down a rabbit hole. Now, you may feel that way, or you may realize that you've got a gloomy outlook on a situation, or something doesn't feel right, or you seem distracted, or you may feel like your progress on something has just ground to a halt. Think about that spreadsheet. Had it done good enough 30 minutes in, and now all of a sudden I'm 3 hours and I don't feel like I'm making progress. Those are some of the ways that you can recognize a rabbit hole. Not to mention, if you see a white rabbit with a pocket watch, head down a hole, there's a rabbit hole. But anyway, those are some of the ways that you can recognize a rabbit hole. And there are going to be other things that will be specific to you. And I'd love to hear any feedback you have on how you recognize you're in a rabbit hole and how you deal with it. Just use that feedback form because I'd love to be able to bring that on the show next week as follow up. Okay, so we know how this happens, or at least we've thought about how it happens. We have an idea of what it does to us. We're trying to figure out how to recognize it. What do we do? Well, let's talk about two things. Let's talk about the assignment rabbit holes and let's talk about those mental rabbit holes. Okay. For the assignment rabbit holes, If you realize that you spent an hour on something that was really done well enough, remember from previous episodes, good enough sometimes really is good enough. So if you realize that you spent an hour on something that was really done well a long time ago, stop and take stock of what you're doing. Does it really need to get better? Is it really going to get better? Is it that much better than what it was 30 minutes in? And be careful to get caught up saying things like, well, I've already gone this far. I might as well keep going, because there's this false perception that I've already invested this much into it. I just need to keep investing. I keep investing. You've got to deliberately take a look at it and say, yeah, it's just not going to get any better. So I'm just going to stop. Right. I told this story a while ago about looking at presentations over and over and over again, and how I always look at them and can find something else to try and make them perfect. But at some point, they are good enough. So you need to do that evaluation, and you might actually have to walk away for a bit. Put the computer to sleep, walk away from it, walk away from that chore or that thing you're trying to do, and gain some perspective. Try and look at it from the outside. Again, this is if you're doing some sort of task or assignment and you've noticed that you're a lot further into it than you thought you would. Think about whether it was really done a long time ago and you're just spinning your wheels. So take that perspective, walk away from it if you have to, and then make a deliberate decision as to what's next and hold yourself to that decision. If that means stopping and going back to that earlier point, do it. If you know you need to wrap something up, set yourself a time limit if you can and say, I'm only going to do this and then I'm going to be done. So that's for those assignments or task things that you're doing. Now, for the mental rabbit holes, and this is kind of what happened to me when I was right before I prepared for this show. Number one thing is to admit to yourself that that's what's going on, that you are mentally going down a rabbit hole, that there's maybe nothing really wrong with this situation you're thinking about, but you started to make it more complicated, or you're taking yourself down this mental rabbit hole. So admit to yourself what's happening. Number two, avoid making any critical decisions when you're in the middle of this. This is like if you're so emotionally charged, you probably shouldn't be making a decision. Same kind of thing, right? If you don't have to, don't make any critical decisions until you can get back to some more solid footing. Then you need to try and focus in on what matters most versus where you're headed, right? So if I'm headed down this mental pathway and that's not the thing that's most important, but it's consuming me, I need to recognize that that's not the path that I want to go down and try and get myself back on the path where I want to go. Pay attention to what's in front of you. That's one of the things that can help with this. For me, this means not overcomplicating things, keeping them simple, just looking at the solution that's right there instead of me trying to invent a new one. I mean, I used to be big time into spreadsheets when I was doing call center work and we couldn't afford to buy the big call center tools. I built all of our staffing tools and scheduling tools and all of that kind of stuff out of spreadsheets, and they were complicated. And I had 5 or 6 spreadsheets that all updated each other, and it was a mess. Right? They were big enough that I could watch the computer spin to update everything. That was fine for then, because I kind of had to do it. But that led me to keep thinking, oh, I can just do everything. I can overcomplicate things, and that's not a good thing. Okay. Another thing that you might have to do, and this is what I ended up having to do, these next few things, something that I ended up having to do to get out of this mental rabbit hole that I was headed down last week, is I had to do something to get out of it. So luckily, I started this on Thursday, which is our date night, and we go to the temple and then we go have dinner. So I knew that I was going to get a break at that point. And even that wasn't quite enough. And then the next day ended up planning a bike ride. I said, I'm just going to have to go out for a bike ride. So those two things, but they also bookended a good night's sleep. And I can't tell you how many times I start getting worked up about something and I start thinking through it and it's hard to fall asleep or whatever the case may be. And I wake up the next morning and I go, why was I so concerned about that? Or why was I trying to follow that particular path so intently? So, yes, you may have to step away. You may have to find those things that you do to recharge, that refill your well, that help you get new perspective. For me, like I said, it's dates and dates with my wife and temple and bike rides and camping. But then also, you just might need to sleep on it and let your brain do some of that mental reset that it does overnight to try and give you some additional perspective. Those are my suggestions on the rabbit holes, the mental ones. Now, just my disclaimer, as I always do on this stuff, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a professional, any of that kind of stuff. These are just some things that have worked for me. So if you can find these kinds of things that work for you, great. But if you need professional help, please get it, because sometimes you need professional help to help you get out of some of these mental rabbit holes. So we've covered what these rabbit holes might be, how they happen, what it can do to us, how we can recognize them, and some things that we can do to try and be deliberate when we're in these kinds of rabbit holes or in these situations. And there are two things that I hope you take away from this episode. One, recognize that all of us go down rabbit holes on occasion. I've talked about two types, but there are many, many more. Watching a cool YouTube video, and 2 hours later, you've watched 100 on a topic you didn't even know existed. Or you're shopping for that perfect gift and you end up spending hours online on sites you've never heard of, trying to find this and that and all of the variations. I mean, I think we've all experienced some of those kinds of things. Those are a little bit simpler than these. I'm caught up in a task or an assignment, or I've got this mental thought process that's going on. But those can all be rabbit holes too that we need to be deliberate about. And the second thing that I hope you take away from all of this is that we can recognize these rabbit holes. Maybe not always in the moment, but hopefully, if we can't in the moment, we can learn from them. But if we can do anything to recognize them in the moment, we can be deliberate and make deliberate decisions on how these rabbit holes are going to impact us. I didn't talk a lot about times when going down rabbit holes can lead to amazing things or opportunities. I'm sure to a certain extent that's how inventions happen and new ideas and processes. That might be a topic for another day. But I believe that the rabbit holes that are most impactful to us, or maybe those that happen most often, are the ones that are not going to be beneficial, especially if we allow them to continue to consume us and don't try and get out of them, either by getting some help or talking to somebody else, or some of those things that I talked about earlier about recognizing it and taking action on it. Think back to Alice's interaction in Wonderland with the Cheshire Cat. She asked which path to take, and he said, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter. Well, how often do we know where that rabbit hole is going to take us? And how often do we just have no idea? And so if we end up following the rabbit hole, we're just going to end up wherever it goes. I mean, that's not what we want to do. We want to be deliberate. If we want to follow our path, and if we want to reach for our greatest potential, then I think we have to know where we're going so that we can take the right path. And these rabbit holes and these distractions are going to come up on a regular basis. It's going to happen. And sometimes we're just going to go through them and won't be able to do anything about them. But if we can do anything to be deliberate about these rabbit holes, then that'll give us a better shot at staying on the path towards our most potential. Well, that's it for today. It's a little bit shorter episode, but I hope you found something in here that's useful. Just don't forget to do all the things, the like, the shares, check out the YouTube channel, all of that kind of stuff. And until next week, catch yourself early on in one of these rabbit holes. I'm sure something will come up. And be deliberate about how you handle it so that you end up where you want to go instead of wherever the path is going to take you. Thanks again. Have a great week.